This podcast is brought to you by the Albany Public Library main branch and the generosity of listeners like you. What is a podcast? God, Daddy, these people talk as much as you do. Razib Khan's Unsupervised Learning.
Thanks for listening to the ungated version of the Unsupervised Learning podcast. If you want to read some essays on some of these topics, please check out razib.substack.com. Again, that's razib.substack.com. Thank you.
Hey, everybody. I hope you guys are doing well. Thank you for joining me on this episode of the Unsupervised Learning podcast. Today, I'm here with my friend, an engineer, an erstwhile Twitter engineer, Nikolai Yakovenko, and we are going to be talking about Twitter, social media, technology, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, as I'm recording this, there have been some changes in the ownership, but we will get to that. But we will talk about what his experiences working at Twitter were, what he knows that maybe we would like to know, hopefully. But Nikolai, do you want to introduce yourself with anything else?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Razib. I'm a machine learning engineer and applied machine learning scientist. Kind of like stumbled into it out of college. My first job was working on Google search, which is a lot of fun and very gratifying to be able to make tiny little changes to the search function that would be used by millions of people. So I got pretty spoiled there. Um, not going to go through my whole tech career, but kind of out of that, got into applied machine learning for various different problems, and ended up some years later at Twitter, on the applied deep learning team. A team that still exists is called Cortex, although most of the founding people have left, which is part of the story. Yeah. And then finally now I have a startup working in machine learning in the crypto space, specifically for estimating, basically we call it price oracles. So, historical and current value for NFTs, right? There's a large number of individual items that are not like liquid, like a Bitcoin or Ethereum would be. So estimating what they're worth in the market, so you can sort of score your portfolio, negotiate trades, use it as collateral, all kinds of fun things like that. So that's what I'm up to these days.
Wait, what's your startup called again?
Oh, it's called Deep NFT Value. You can check it out. We have a public facing thing, and we're looking for people to join. So if you're interested in crypto, blockchain, and have at least some interest in NFTs, would love to talk to you as well.
Well, I mean, because you already raised before the crypto winter, right?
Yeah. I mean, I guess you could call it a winter. Definitely a crypto fall. Yeah, no, we raised a $4 million round, closed out this late this summer, and we haven't spent very much of that yet, so that's good.
So before I go further, I think maybe you should tell the listener. I mean, a lot of listeners already know, but some of them do not. What machine learning is, and then what deep learning is.
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. So when I went to work for Google, I mean, obviously machine learning as a concept existed, but it wasn't even something we talked about. But basically the idea is look at something like Google search or then the next great machine learning product that we all used and sort of loved or not, which is the Facebook and then later the Instagram timeline. So that's really, you're using machines to sort of at a high level make decisions that a human might do, or to sort of solve judgment level tasks essentially automatically in real time. So I remember the head of search when I was at Google, he had a way of telling the story, right? He's like, well, when you type in a query into Google, you're looking for something. If you had an expert in the field who had infinite time and space and could sort of like go through the websites and rank them and give you the top 10, then that theoretical person would do significantly better than Google search. But what we're trying to do, in our 300-person team then, right, was to do that very fast, automatically, approximate what that person would do fast, automatically, and also in a way that's like structured and reliable, right? So you can kind of predict what the machine is going to do, whereas a person would kind of, make more random decisions sometimes. So that's the way you think about it. I mean, you could think about it as anything from predictive modeling, to things like, well, like pricing hotel rooms, like what is demand going to be, to like, obviously, like one of my favorite sort of, applied machine learning problems in the wild is like is like rental car stuff, right? Managing rental car fleets and pricing you automatically. If you're going to drive from Vegas to LA, sometimes one way will be cheaper, sometimes another way will be cheaper because they sort of know where they need cars, what they expect the demand to be. So these are all like problems that in the past were solved through human judgment, maybe are solved through some sort of like formula if then, but eventually they switch over to machine learning, which means you sort of look at the past, you look at the features, and you try to predict what would be the best decision for the near future.
Hmm.
Um, and in that way, you've asked about deep learning. So deep learning is a technology. There, really, the idea is to train these like very large models that have a huge number of parameters, and to really focus on like the structure of the network, to sort of generalize from experience. So, like the first problem to not really the first, but the first like popular problem to be really like crushed by by deep learning as opposed to previous things is basically like identifying cats and dogs in pictures, like putting a box around it. If some of you used Facebook, I guess a lot of us don't anymore, but remember it was the first thing. It was cool, identified your friends automatically. You would draw like a box around their picture, and you just had to confirm, and it was getting it right, basically every time pretty quickly. Whereas I remember when Microsoft and Apple had similar technology, 5 to 7 years earlier, and it was right like 80% of the time, which is frankly not acceptable. Like for these things to work, they really need to be quite accurate and really
Hmm.
specific. So deep learning is kind of a technology. Yeah.
Well, I mean, so basically, I think one way that I like to think of it is, uh, it's scaling up and doing things that humans could do, right? I mean, in terms of, we take information, training sets, we see patterns, and then we detect the patterns and we make an inference. And with machine learning, you write some code that processes these data inputs coming in, and it extracts out insights, patterns, structures in the data, and then can, like, generate conclusions from the inputs that are coming in later, beyond the training set, right? Is that one
That's
way you
right.
can think about it?
Yeah, so you're describing something called generalization, which is that you have past data and you train the model on past data, and you sort of expect and hope that given completely new inputs that are a little bit different or very different from what you've seen in the past, you'll still get reasonable answers to your point. One small sort of point I would make though is that yeah, two things. So one is yes, basically machine learning, especially with deep learning, which is really great technology. I would say at this point, basically, if there's any task that you could teach to a human, like a cognitive task, putting aside robots and physical tasks, but any sort of cognitive task that you could teach a person, within a few weeks, who's not a super duper duper domain expert. We're not talking about surgeons with 20 years of experience. That is something that I think you would expect the machine could also be taught to do at a similar level. Now, the issue you're going to have is dealing with sort of like out of sample, right? Like an extreme situation that didn't happen in training. For example, unlike the Tesla self-driving cars, people would post these issues where it would have really strange responses to emergency vehicles or snow or something like that it wasn't trained on, while it would drive beautifully, sort of in sunshine, right, with normal conditions.
Yeah.
So
So I've heard with the self-driving cars, and also sometimes with robots that have to, respond to novel conditions. Sometimes they will just do crazy things that make
yeah,
no sense, and so
yeah, it's
uh,
out of sample. It's out of sample, right? Like it just hasn't had any experience, and you as a person you can switch to like a certain level of judgment, right? And then also, to be fair to the robots, the roads were designed for humans. They were not designed for self-driving cars. So we're like expect like if the roads were designed for self-driving cars, then they would be much better at humans by far already, but they're not.
well, I mean, like in some ways, I wonder if this is just random, but like trains or airplanes are much better cases than self-driving cars, because they're pretty demarcated and specific, and they're already like heavily automated anyway.
Oh, totally. Yeah, I think a friend of mine was involved, actually on the security side for the train system in Switzerland, which is, I think, one of the best train systems in the world. And it doesn't have any conductors. It doesn't have everything. Everything is completely automated with the exception of like there's edge cases that it's just easier for a human to remotely operate than to design a computer system to do it. And the one he noted is like shoveling the snow. If there's like snow in the tracks, the train actually has a machine that can do stuff to clear the snow. But instead of having it like automatically clear the snow and use computer vision to figure out where the snow drifts are, it's just easier for a human to just wire in and remote control it, you know? But apparently that's the only thing that humans do at all on
Mm-hmm.
the Swiss trains. But to your point, that's a controlled environment, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Twitter is not, and I'm
Yeah.
we're talking to you. We want to talk about social media, although I do appreciate just kind of like the quick verbal primer there about machine learning, because I'm sure it's a word that a lot of people have heard, but it sounds quite exotic. But then when you break it down, I mean, some people, I think this is overly reductive, but some people are like, oh, you're just talking about regression, like regression analysis. So there's a bunch of different techniques that are bracketed under machine learning, these like formalizations of taking in input data and just making sense out of it, right? I mean, that's the simple way to say it. So with Twitter, I mean, what are you guys doing? Can you identify, I mean, I'm assuming people want to identify what a troll is. Can you automatically identify a troll?
Yeah, no, that's kind of frustrating because yeah, absolutely. The to to sort of to defend Twitter a bit, um, some combination of sort of things I believe, and also devil's advocate, because I think it's interesting to hear that side. I think I'll be saying that throughout this conversation in many ways. I think people don't have a lot of experience dealing with spam. So the issue dealing with spam, and I learned this from Google, is you really you really have like massive imbalances. Like you look at the piece of spam that you see and it's like, OMG, this is easy to identify. And in many ways, you're right. And in many ways, these companies should do a better job. Directionally, those critiques are correct. The issue is that if you kick in an automated system that um, kicks out 1,000 pieces of spam, and then one out of 1,000 they like ban like a real user, there's kind of an imbalance there, right? Because the computers can just create 10,000 times more messages than humans, right? So the real issue is at a high level is you really want to be careful not to ban real people, because you kind of want new people to sign up to Twitter or to Facebook or whatever. And um, you know even something like 2 to 1, 10 to 1 spam to human is actually not the right ratio if that's what you're doing. And then on top of it, you don't know
Mm-hmm.
what you're doing. It's actually very hard to get feedback, right? So now it can be done. Like Google, for example, has basically no spam. Like when you search in Google, you will never see spam. That wasn't always the case, and it's not the case for new things. In any new service, as soon as it explodes, you get like inundated with spam. I think kind of a famous case that is well known in Silicon Valley is when Instagram was first bought by Facebook for the $1 billion. They kept running their own team and their own scaling and their own stuff with Facebook support. But the one thing that they immediately turned on was like the Facebook, like spam detection, and that's ironic given how much spam there still is at Instagram, but that's because people are really incentivized to do it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So these are difficult
Mm-hmm.
problems. I mean, I think part of it is a cost thing. Obviously, anytime you're doing any security or reducing spam, it's not directly making you money. So like you're not going to spend 80% of your revenue on something that's basically like a safety measure. That just doesn't make any sense. So it's inherently like in just a game theory of it, it's always going to be something that's a little bit neglected, a little bit underfunded, a little bit less exciting for the best engineers, the best engineering managers to hitch their train onto, because it has nothing really to do with growth or making money or
Mm-hmm.
any of the cool stuff. But I think part of it is the main thing people really don't appreciate is, again, that ratio that the computers can basically make infinite amounts of spam, and you really need to like if you check in a change, you're not really looking at the ratio of how much your good bad stuff you're banning to how much good stuff you're sort of banning accidentally. You're really looking at your absolute amount of good stuff you're banning, and if you're banning real people, it's a real problem, you know.
Yeah, this hasn't happened lately. I don't know why. Maybe I'm not paying attention, or maybe it's gotten better. But I've heard from people that I know who've been identified as bots and put
Yeah,
in Twitter jail or
sucks.
given
No, it's
warning. And
horrible.
yeah, it's like, I mean, but the reaction is, "What am I doing? That's like a bot." Not me.
Well,
It's never happened to me, but
No, Razib, and then going back to the machine learning conversation we just had a minute ago, like those cases really can be bizarre, right? Because, again, these machine learning systems are not necessarily very good out of sample, if you do something novel. So think of something else. I mean, I'm going to try not to have too many tangents, but like the way this was handled before good machine learning was something called like an anomaly system, right? You used to have, how would you like detect like have an intruder in your system? You have anomalies, like they're like, this is normal activity. And then anything that's like super weird would just like trigger and shut off people's accounts. So that could be an intruder, that could be spam, but it could also be like maybe people don't log in and compile. Like maybe you're working at a biotech lab, they don't use some like very legitimate like coding systems, and then those things would immediately be flagged and cut off, right? So yeah, it's machines don't think like people at all, and then also like yeah, so that some of the things they identify as spam wouldn't make any sense to us at all whatsoever.
Yeah, I mean, so in terms of identifying spam, identifying trolls, like these sorts of things are a big deal. But from what I understand, Twitter has an enormous amount of human content moderation. Uh, are they the last like guardrail? Like you haven't been there in a while, but do you have any sense of what the ratio here is of? Because like, so for example, Gmail, most of the spam is filtered out, a little bit gets through. I do wonder sometimes if there's stuff that doesn't come through that's false identified, but I very rarely get messages about that. It's there are some cases, some very few cases. Like actually one happened this week. Someone sent me an attachment, a PDF attachment of their book, and they had never emailed me before. So I suspect what Google thought was this is a new email address and there's a large PDF, there's a large file attached to it. Like, what does that mean? Right. And there wasn't any text associated with it. It was just the title of his book. So it said it was spam, and I had to go into the spam filter and get it. But I mean, in terms of the triage or the division of tasks, why are there all these human content moderators still around?
Great. So actually, let me touch on the Google spam thing for a second because it's a very interesting example. I'm glad you brought it up. Like, so first of all, I'm going to disagree slightly. I think that Google, a lot of spam does get through, and then much worse than that, there's a ton of real content that gets caught in the spam filter. So you brought up a great example of individual stuff, but like if you're sending, anybody who sends like email lists and things like that, they have this issue constantly, right? Like um, also if you use certain words, it's just going to get picked up as spam. I mean, imagine if someone send you a PDF about Viagra. I mean, there's no chance that's getting through. Like that's going to get crushed by the spam filter.
Yeah, that's fair.
And
That's fair. Things that I've heard of things like that where people used a spam word is literally what people said, I think.
yeah, and and then you cannot get that through, and it doesn't matter, and it's very frustrating because there's nothing you can really do about it. Like Google doesn't care. They're not going to fix it. They're not going to change it. Like from their perspective. And again, this has to go to what I was saying before. It's not a very good from a high level because enough people don't care. Like they're not going to spend 10x more money on spam detection. They're just not, and um, yeah, it's just it's always going to be like this, essentially, in my opinion. But going to the Twitter thing. So first of all, I mean, I'm not sure Google really has that much content moderation. I actually don't think that team is that large. It definitely is at Facebook. So Facebook has a huge team doing content moderation and clicking and checking stuff. I think my perspective, my perspective was the Twitter team was always a bit underfunded on that actually, and I would imagine that may get even more so now. So um, and I actually had friends in engineering who worked on the spam filters. And going back to that for a second, also, I mean, they're constantly like writing like new rules, right? So, for example, in crypto, you would get these very specific spams over and over and over, and it like makes sense to write that rule that like this should be a feature and throw that into the regression. But then these rules get stale. People work around them. They accidentally pick up other things. Like there's not even a way to do it very cleanly. So. Um, yeah, I mean, I think I'm not sure how Twitter does its content review. I mean, I guess it's good that they get back to people, but my perspective is actually more that Facebook is the one with a giant team, and Twitter is more like triaging and trying to keep the lights on.
Well, so can you talk really quickly? You're talking about having to update things, and these systems getting stale. A friend of mine who works in machine learning said one thing that people don't understand, and I've used machine learning, obviously. I think we all have in the compute space that analyze data at this point, but I don't have enough experience to judge this. He said, one thing people don't understand machine learning is it requires a lot of human intelligence to use it properly, right? So what do you think of that assertion?
Yes, I think that's true. And I think that's specifically true in the case of spam, because again, the way you measure and train things is you want to say these are positive examples, these are negative examples, right? Like, can you get to a classifier? People will say ridiculous numbers like 99% accurate or something like that. That's not even how we measure it. I mean, you know this from the genetic space, Raziv, right? Like, if you're trying to call certain variants, like some things are easy, some things are hard. So you sort of look on the curve. Doesn't really matter outside the scope here, but the point is fundamentally when you're training models and measuring them, you're saying how many things do I get right, how many things do I get wrong, and they're just different ways of measuring, that, from a precision recall perspective. So if you don't have the human knowledge to understand which cases are actually quite bad, or the way you should have designed the feature to be a little bit different to be accurate, like, yeah, all machine learning can do is optimize the model presentation that you give it, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like for example, you could, and also in Twitter, you're dealing with multiple modalities. So like one problem that I think is frankly not very controversial at all, I would think, that our team was involved in was, you wanted to, so Twitter allows pornography, um, but not all kinds, obviously. But they're pretty loose about it, I guess. But people still want to identify it because they don't want pornography to appear in search, and much more importantly, they don't want to appear it with next to ads. People don't like seeing their ad next to hardcore pornography. So it was sort of useful to write classifiers to identify this, and they're trying to identify it from what? From like the account activity, some of the text, and also from the actual images and videos. So you've got this sort of, for a pretty simple problem, you have
Mm.
a pretty complicated system. We have to look at different kinds of data, then making, sort of joint predictions, measuring those against each other. And, I think, like we needed deep learning, which was our team, because doing it without the images was frankly impossible like the gap between doing it with and without the images was massive. But it still gets it wrong all the time. I've tweeted that a couple times, but there's particular queries that I do, or even like I hit like a trending tabs, and I'll just see pornography right there show up in the search. And usually it's the first result also for whatever reason. Because I think when it does it, I think my guess is that model also has some sort of trade off where it's kind of like when it accidentally shows you pornography, it's going to be stuff that also got like a lot of engagement as well for whatever reason. Like a lot of people
Mm-hmm.
favorited. I don't know who's going out there favoriting pornography on Twitter, but apparently a lot of people do. Uh,
Yeah, there's one woman. I still follow her, I think, but I muted her because she's a very mischievous type. That's what I'm gonna
yeah,
label her as. And she does retweet pornography into my timeline. Literally, she's the only one. I would not know that Twitter. This is one of the things when they talk about censorship. Twitter does have a lot of. I mean, a lot of people actually don't know that Twitter has a lot of porn, but it does. You just don't
it
ever
does.
see it. You
That's
just
right.
never
And
see it.
it doesn't show up in search like at all, except by accident. So even if you wanted to search for a pornographic account, you would actually like it would be you would actually have a hard time finding it. You'd have to either type it in directly, or you would have to search for it on Google. Because of course Google will gladly show you Twitter pornography and doesn't care at all.
Yeah, yeah. For now, so Twitter is a business, and it's had some issues with growth. And one thing that we have actually talked about this offline earlier, but I do want you to touch on it. I get some of the worst advertisements. So I think people who follow me on Twitter know that my personality is I'm not I would not be a really good candidate for diversity training advertisements, or diversity HR advertisements. And I've been getting that a lot recently, and that's not the only thing I get. I understand with this celebrity, what you don't know about. Okay, like that I can see, because that's just apolitical, and everyone's kind of interested in that, even if you don't click all the time. But some of these like misses, are the misses just salient to me, or is this a huge problem?
Yeah. So I mean, yeah, we can do a deep dive on the Twitter advertising thing in a second because it's actually pretty interesting. But let me just sort of guess. I'm speculating wildly here, but I would guess that there's two reasons you would see those ads. Um, One is that they're just being shown like in general, like for example, being in New York, I used to see a lot of political ads around elections on Twitter, and I don't think that they're really like checking whether you would support this policy or this candidate, whatever. It's more like, look, you're active, and you're in New York, right? So it could be something literally like that. In your case, though, I would actually push back a little bit, and I think from a machine perspective, I actually don't think that these are particularly bad ads for you, to be honest, because you are adjacent to a lot of people who sort of care about diversity and inclusion, and like the bit flip, like the 180 thing is actually often like it seems like very bad, but it's actually very close, right? The person you don't want to show that ad to is someone who has no interest in that space at all. And I would argue you actually have a lot of interest in that space. You just disagree with that
Hmm.
point of view. That point of view, you know,
Yeah. I mean, does Twitter use people you follow? Because I have a lot of
it
reciprocal
a
follows
lot,
with
a lot.
scientists. Yeah. So I follow, like, it's changed over the years as I've gotten more followers and they've probably gotten a little bit more right leaning, but I've normally had a uniform ideological distribution. And in terms of who I follow, probably until very recently, I followed a good majority of liberals because I follow scientists and they're just
That's
liberal,
right.
you know?
That's basically it. So I think, yeah, think of it that way. So think about it is okay. So I'm not going to do the whole deep dive, but I'll give a quick spiel on how on like personalized advertising, right? So the strongest signals are not really that personal. They're going to be more like demographic, like where you live, and then like who's your circle. So absolutely. So if I was personalizing advertisements for you at all at Twitter, I would be very focused on which city you are. If you either tag it in the photos, like you give it to them, or you can guess from your connections. Um, I would also be interested in your sort of like where you are in the socioeconomic thing. So again, based on your connections, I would guess that you would, you would be, sort of, certain age, a certain like wealth level, things like that. That's the kind of stuff where you start. And then on top of that, you're right. The only thing that Twitter really has that's any good at all as a signal is really your connections, which are much more useful than your tweets because people retweet random things. And if like your Twitter is very good and very curated, but like that is the vast majority, sorry, minority of advertising recipients. The vast majority of people on Twitter don't tweet at all, and they retweet kind of randomly. They retweet like the basketball team, you know what I
I
mean?
see.
Which doesn't mean they're,
I
yeah.
see. There's nothing to train on. I train it a lot, but most people do not.
No. So you just have to see which city they are in, if they tell it
Uh-huh.
to you, and who they follow, and that's it. These are like the actual only signals, if you really want to think about it at a high level.
I see. I see. Okay. Okay, that's interesting. Yeah. And I think you did tell me about that before. It's almost like if you want to see good ads, I gotta like follow a subset of people or something. I don't know, or not good ads, but ads geared towards me. I have to engage in more homophily.
Well, the biggest problem is there really are not good ads on Twitter, which is very sad. But Twitter has basically, and Ben Thompson covers this very well, but I mean, I can confirm it's completely true from my perspective, is basically Twitter. Okay, so taking a step back, is the way Twitter sort of thought of themselves very arrogantly, but sort of you can't really blame them too much, is that there were, and people would literally say this. They were like, okay, first there was, Google, right? Because people forget about Microsoft. There was Google, that was like the company of the day. Then it was Facebook, and like next is Twitter. They really thought that they were the next company, which is like hard to imagine now, but that's what people were thinking. I mean, when Twitter IPO'd, they IPO'd at something like 20 or 30% of Facebook's valuation. I remember some people were like, this is completely absurd. Like you're talking about a great company and a very flawed company, like the traffic numbers aren't comparable, the tech stack isn't comparable. And clearly they were right. So the point is basically like, um, they started with running a pretty sophisticated self-serve ad business, which is how sort of Facebook dominates it, direct response, all that stuff, but it kind of failed and now you don't see it. So like the real problem for Twitter is that they actually don't have that many advertisements. And then the advertisers they have tend to be like very broad-based brand advertisers. They actually spend a huge amount of money, way more than Facebook, on like designing Twitter specific campaigns. Like the NBA is going to do a hashtag, sort of like some big soap company is going to do a hashtag. They're going to do a custom emoji. I mean, and like what specifically those things changes every couple of years, but they work really hard to sign up big advertisers, and then everything else is sort of just like, you know, like it's just not a big enough business to really invest in. Like they're just the long tail of advertisers are just not very good, not very deep. So, you know, it's a chicken and egg problem, right? Like they could build a lot more better tools and better targeting to attract them, but then you would also need to like attract them at the same time. And they used to have those advertisers, and like everyone tried Twitter, it didn't work for them, and they stopped.
Okay, so I'm just gonna ask you like a pop question, kind of. Yeah, I don't know if you're gonna be able to tell me immediately. Basically, you work there. You're an engineer. You were inside the castle, so to speak. What about Twitter would you tell people that they do not understand, that people on the outside have a
Sure.
misimpression?
I mean, a lot of it, right? So I think, and again, I think people directionally, people who are like on Twitter a lot, who are very invested in the platform, I think directionally they're often right. But like mechanically, they don't understand how things work at all. So for example, people are like, oh, why does Twitter have all of these people? And I just touched on it a second ago. Like it actually takes a lot of work to sign up large advertisers, because large advertisers are going to go to Facebook because everyone's on Facebook. They may go to Snap because Snap has a certain demographic that Facebook doesn't cover as well. They're certainly going to go to TikTok, right? Why would a big brand advertiser go to Twitter? I mean, you can't just bring them in with lower rates, because they do charge less per ad than Facebook, obviously. But like they actually go out there and say, look, we're going to design this great campaign for you, you know, and they have, and they really have. Like they're like the big advertisers do advertise on Twitter. I mean, most of the stuff I see is brand advertising, and I think that's true sort of broadly. So a lot of people do like need to do that, you know. If you fired all those people, okay, where's the ad inventory going to come from? You know, like it's a common, you know. But you would think, if you don't think through the problem, that Twitter wouldn't need to have as many people as, let's just say, Facebook working on ads, because they don't show as many ads. They're a smaller platform, but in a sense, they actually need more people because they're further behind. You know, that's one misconception. And the other one is just like the amount of effort that it takes to just maintain the app, just keep it sort of synced with the latest iOS and Android changes. I mean, you have to remember, I mean, Twitter is a relatively simple app, but there's still like a lot of stuff going on. There's a lot of languages. There's a lot of, you know, and it actually works pretty smoothly. Like I think we've all seen, you know, who've tried like the Twitter clone competitors, just what a disaster those things are, UI wise, lag wise, rendering wise,
Mm.
you know, being able to find things. Like there's a lot of things that actually Twitter works pretty smoothly, so we take it for granted, just on very basic things like being able to serve you the content, you know.
All right. Okay. So I do have to say, I think, and a lot of the listeners are probably on Twitter, but not all of them. It seems like the fail whale, when the Twitter used to go down, is a lot less frequent. So basically, I mean,
Yep,
over the
yep.
last decade, they've really amped up the engineering.
Yeah, yeah. So no, I'm glad you brought it up. Exactly. So when I mean, I don't know when you started on Twitter. I'm guessing it's around the same time I did, which was sort of like early-ish, but not super
Hmm.
early. When you would get the fail whale sometimes. There's even another thing that happened. So when I was at Twitter, you know, there was a couple of rounds of layoffs. I mean, Twitter's had rolling layoffs for quite some time, and at one point they did cut. So this is called a SRE, a site reliability engineer, but basically there's kind of fundamentally two kinds of quote unquote normal engineers in big FAANG companies. There's people who like build, you know, build and improve and
Hey,
maintain the app. Yeah,
really
good.
quick, Nikolai, you just dropped Fang. Tell them what Fang is.
Oh yeah, that's just Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, which is kind of a weird one there, and Google. So basically, yeah, like the big, like, you know, the so-called big tech,
All
right?
right,
Silicon
Nikolai,
Valley.
I got to interrupt you again.
Yeah.
If you dropped Netflix, it would not work.
That's right. And then if you well, I guess Google is Alphabet, right? So it would be just fa.
Yeah. Anyway, go on.
Yeah, you might have to rearrange the letters in the other combination. But yeah, exactly. You got Fang, you got bricks, and these people like these things. So yeah, so basically you have two kinds of engineers: people who build out the product, maintain the product, and then there's site reliability engineers, which are actually the people who have something called PagerDuty. When things break, they like triage it. When things go down, they have to fix it. If a server dies, they bring up the new one. Generally speaking, in Silicon Valley, like if you're a development engineer, if you're a normal engineer, or especially a research engineer, which is kind of what I did most of the time, you would never be like supporting a live product. Somebody else will support the live product. So yeah, I mean, Twitter needs those people to make sure that small outages don't escalate, right? And that is a fail whale thing you talked about. So, and again, and even when I was there, like they did a little bit of layoffs there, and like what, Twitter got pretty unreliable for a while, yeah. So there's definitely a direct correlation between how many people and how well staffed that is, and just Twitter like being live all the time. It's a good point.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you don't think partly it's also like the cloud and just these distributed storage technologies and like, computing have also gotten better?
Oh yeah, so that's a good point. So remember though that Twitter predates that. So is kind of old. Twitter was not actually built on AWS. Twitter was built on their own scaling thing. And to their enormous credit, I have to say, Twitter, I want to say last year, but like pretty recently, switched off their main services from their own cloud, actually like to AWS. Which is expensive and difficult and sort of like a big you know, sort of like humbling moment where you're saying, look, we're not actually good at running this. We're better off having someone else do it. Um, but I mean, you can only imagine how much effort that takes to build a parallel system, to test it and to swap it over, while it's running at scale,
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Twitter. So that's the other thing is if you think about it, like when you build a new service, you're building, I'm not going to name them, but you're building some Twitter clone, no one has experience with like something that actually like runs at scale. Like there's a tiny number of services that actually have millions of users interacting, having their own stuff, etc. And and yeah, I mean, if you build it from scratch, you could sort of do it better, but you would need to bring in people who've done it before. Like it's not something you can really clone. And then Twitter also has all the legacy of it, so they have to sort of decide: are we going to rebuild it to take advantage of the new technology, as you pointed out? Are we going to keep it going? Sometimes you have to maintain two systems in parallel for a smooth switch over. It's a lot of work.
So it almost sounds like let's talk about more timely. We don't know, like, 2 years from the future, this is going to be, or 2 years into the future, this part of the conversation, I think, is going to feel kind of like of historical note. Whereas I feel like the first half of the conversation that we've had so far is going to, like deep learning is going to be deep learning for decades, right? So I mean, that'll be relevant. So we've just had an ownership transition at Twitter, and there were these rumors of 75% layoffs and all of this stuff going on. From your perspective as a former Twitter engineer, did you always think that the 75% layoffs were just hot air? Because I know people that work there now in product, and I'm not gonna name names, obviously, but they do believe there is some serious overstaffing issues. Twitter doesn't do product well. There's some sclerosis. So put your business hat on here for a second.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know where the 75% number comes from. It sounds to me like very made up, which is fine. I mean, obviously, it's like the right made up number because it gets people talking. But I mean, even talking to sort of just experienced Silicon Valley business people, I mean, anybody would call Twitter a restructuring. So to be clear, it is bloated. It's inefficient. People are working on different things. Also, like a lot of the best tech people have left. Most of them, I would say, like Silicon Valley is full of great Twitter alumni who still, many of them still like and care about the company, but like they're not coming back. You know, and just like too many priorities. I can dig into it because I can tell you some stories when I was there. Not even very spicy stories, but just kind of like how trying to do too many things. So I think a reasonable person would come in, would not fire 75% of people. What they would do is they would try to figure out, okay, what do we need? Which initiatives we're going to cut? Which ones do we need to support properly? Um, and how do we do that? Like you do need to bring in new engineers, new management, new priorities, but you also have to do it in a way where people believe that this is going to happen, right? Twitter has had so many changes. What would often happen is like a new regime would come in or some new managers would be hired. People were there would be like, yeah, like we'll go along with it, we'll listen to it, but like these people are probably going to quit anyway. I mean, when I was there were just so many senior managers and executives and mid-level managers who would go in and they'd be there for 18 months. So people have to
Y-
really believe that the new changes are actually going to happen. They're going to be permanent. They're going to be planned. You know?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, what you're alluding to is the fact that, okay, how do I say this? Humans, we can think of us as Homo economicus from the economist perspective. We're utility maximizers, we're rationalists. But there's an element in the enterprises and the things we do that are based on kind of alignment to vision, hopes, purposiveness, an almost irrational belief in what you're doing. And so, for example, I think Steve Jobs, what he did in the late 2000s before his death at Apple, seems to be part of it. Yes, Apple pays well. Apple has good people, but he squeezed those people. And part of that was his management, his charisma, his leadership. Whereas, another company, let's Microsoft in the late 2000s under Steve Ballmer, their goal was always to see what other companies did, imitate and exceed. And that's actually quite rational. And that worked for Microsoft in many ways. If you look at their products, like
Oh, it still does. So I mean,
yeah.
Ben Thompson talks about this all the time. Like basically, like even say Microsoft Teams, which you know, which no one loves, kind of crushed Slack. It stopped Slack in their tracks in a similar way that like Instagram sort of cut off Snap's growth. It didn't get anyone to quit Slack, but what it did is it offered an alternative that was free. It
Hmm.
was bundled. It's like more secure, and it's like, and they're not even trying to be feature like shot for shot parody. They're like, it's good enough. You're going to use it, and it works because it's integrated. It's part of your suite. So they still do that extremely well at Microsoft.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I want to say you have mentioned Ben Thompson a couple times. He runs a newsletter, Stratachery, and it's one of the most prominent newsletters out there, actually. It's very early. And a lot of people on Substack who have newsletters, even though he's not on Substack, they tried to recruit him, and I think he turned them away because he can.
Yeah,
Ben Thompson is kind of a mentor, kind of a hero. So I just want to put that out there. People are curious about it. In terms of tech news, his daily newsletter is great. But yeah, so we have these different strategies, and now we have Elon Musk. I think he's still the richest man in the world. Now he owns Twitter, and he's actually like a power user of the platform. So why did he buy Twitter? I think ultimately, uh, it's like the old hair club for men thing, where he's going to be using this and he's owning it, or I mean, I think there's other investors, but um do you think, I mean, because a lot of the people internally, from what I see in the news, and also those people who hate the news, is that they don't like Elon Musk, and they are worried, and they can barely breathe. I don't know. There are some people I know internally who have no problem with Musk and they think he's going to clean house, but I don't see that reported.
sure. So one thing I think that's kind of interesting about Twitter, this is true about a lot of companies, but it's extremely true about Twitter, is it's as a business, it's a lot less interesting and valuable than as like a thing, you know? So in that way, it is kind of like a media company. I'm not trying to, say it in terms of the SEC definitions or whatever. But I mean, look, when Jeff Bezos buys the Washington Post, no one thinks for a second that he's buying it because it's like technically a private business and it has like good returns. Like he doesn't want it to lose a ton of money. Maybe he doesn't want it to lose any money, but he's buying it for the influence, for someone else not to have that weapon to use against him. I don't know, but like no one in their right mind thinks that like the Washington Post is not important, even though like as a business it's like whatever. And Twitter is among all tech companies by far the most that way. As a business, it's okay. It's not as bad as people think, but if Elon isn't buying it because of its like revenues, it's buying it because it's interesting, because it's important. And I'm not saying he's doing it for his own personal brand or political reasons. I just think that he's like, it's undervalued as an asset, you know, on a non-accounting basis, basically. It's not based on the P&L.
Yeah, I mean, so one thing, one thing that we can talk about using economic concepts, there are certain industries, certain sectors, where people, certain businesses where people and corporations, institutions, they capture the value that they produce, a great amount of it, and then there's other industries where they don't capture the value that they produce in the same way. So to give a concrete example, let's assume in a hypothetical world, so I'm, not just, this is not average, but there's a superstar teacher, and this teacher is sending these kids, onward and upward, and there's a long track record of value add from this teacher. Okay. Okay, well, I mean, the teacher's not going to capture the value that they add to society. The value that they add to society could be incredible, but their salary is not rising commensurately. On the other hand, there are other professions where, the better you do, you're gonna scale up a lot, right? So,
Yeah, sure.
even
Like when I was in
yeah,
when I was in the hedge
yeah,
fund industry, right?
yes,
Like
yes, finance
that's
one.
the classic example, right? Yeah, I mean, you sort of you live and breathe your P&L. You're as good as as your last trade. It's very stressful, but yeah, I mean, but you do get a pretty good chunk of the value you generate. Yeah,
But the teacher does generate value. It's just that
that's right.
they're positive, there's spillover effects, positive externalities. So innovative technology is like that. Obviously Apple created the iPhone, and it's like the profit maker, since it started, right? I mean, it's really driven the company's stock up and their revenues. But one can argue Apple's still not capturing a lot of the value of that iPhone, because the iPhone transformed our lives for good or bad. So there's positive externalities and there's negative externalities. You can get into arguments about what they are. I think Twitter in particular has a huge amount of externalities, and it's not necessarily capturing the value of that, or a standard business, a business P&L, as you would say, are not like capturing the value that it's producing culturally and socially. And so I think that's what's going on, where Twitter is much more important because of its use in the elite media and whatnot. And it's also it has pretty high traction in places like academia, like politicians use it to communicate to other elite people, and so forth, as a broadcast service. So I think, and I don't know how Twitter is ever going to capture the value, but it is there. You could argue its value is actually, it's actually negative, right? Maybe it's anti-value, but either way, it has an effect. It has an outsized effect in relation to what it's valued at and the revenues it produces, right?
That's right. And I think to your point, just a couple things. I mean, using Microsoft, your favorite example of the conversation, they would specifically say that they want to build an ecosystem, right, around Office, around whatever. And they even would say they want to capture about 7% of the value. They use that number all the time. I don't know, maybe they're bullshitting. They probably are, but
Mm.
like um and I think that's generally been the traditional sort of
Mm-hmm.
the Silicon Valley view, let's just say 20 years ago, right? You're creating all this value, you're capturing a small but non-trivial chunk, and like your partners are like thriving, right? And I think Ben Thompson again mentions just how useful Facebook ads were for like small business, right? Because they were great at direct response, they were great at finding like the niche of people who are like specifically going to be interested in in golf shoes or something, and Twitter was never good at that, and Facebook's amazing at that. So like, who's getting the biggest part of the value? It's actually potentially like the golf shoe makers, because they can find their customers cheaply and they need it. So I think that's sort of true broadly, and I think it's Twitter has absolutely like not done well there at all. You know, but I think as long as they remain prominent in the prestige media in the world and things like that, then people are always going to be interested in the long game. I think the biggest Twitter fans tend to think of themselves as very long term thinkers. You hear that a lot. They're like, well, geez, right now they're breaking even. Basically, Twitter doesn't actually like lose money, and if they want it to be cash flow positive, they can turn that spigot on tomorrow. Like, they're not like going out into the public markets and losing a bunch of money. They're not like when Uber was like losing billions, right? It's just not that kind of business. Like, you know, what they're not doing is that they're not improving their business. But and to your point, they're not capturing the value and the prominence they have. But somebody could just figure that out in a way we don't even anticipate 5 years from now, and the owners will benefit, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you just mentioned Uber. I mean, Uber still hasn't post a profit, right?
No, no, that's not true. So
No.
on an operating basis, they make money in North America. They do.
Okay. 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 Well, I mean, that's good to know. I mean, definitely, the prices have gone up. So they're,
Yeah, they sure have. Yeah, they're well, and that's part of it, right? Is that like look at like Amazon, right? Like Amazon. That's why like this just looking at very basic P&L doesn't really make sense for these growing companies. You really have to look at the you know, like Amazon has made money for many years, but what they would do is they would just invest, they would just reinvest. They would take some mature projects that are like printing money and reinvest that into like more recent projects. And if they ever ran out of recent projects, then they would like acquire Twitch, right? So, I mean, mainly I think they were trying to avoid posting profits, maybe for tax reasons. I don't really know. But the point is, they just had a very
mm,
good system where they would trade off. I even had a friend who was a was like an executive at Amazon, and she was on the third party seller thing, and they would even tell them at the beginning of the year, it's like, look, here's like how many billions you're allowed to lose this year, but like here's what you need to do in terms of growth, and they ran that for years, and eventually they're like, okay, now we're gonna like now we care about profitability. Like they just the high level bean counters did their math and they're like, okay, like now you don't need to grow by 300% a year anymore, but you need to make money. And that's often a very
hmm
easy switch, in a mature thing that's still like a thriving business. I wouldn't necessarily describe Twitter as a thriving business. It's more of a break even sort of like it's a bit more of a stalemate
It's
on the
it's
business side.
it's a sustainable enterprise. It's a going enterprise, right?
It's very much a going concern, but I think yeah, the value and the upside is in the very clearly think like things we can define that are not business based. Just how important it is. No, I mean the fact that even all the countries that ban Twitter, their leaders still post on Twitter, right? Like I find it, very amusing to see that.
Yeah, I mean, okay, I want to ask you what people that you know, because you still know people at Twitter, like you're part of the Twitter diaspora, right?
Yes.
Okay, you know what? Let me ask first, and then I'll end with a couple questions about Elon Musk. Like, what's going on here? What do you guys think? Do you think he's insane? Do you think he's cool? Are you guys just scratching your head? This whole thing from the outside has just seemed like reality. I mean, and we've had a lot of reality TV-esque, like social, political, business things in the last decade. We don't need to get into everything, but this has just seemed off script. The simulation is being weird. It just seems capricious, erratic, out of the blue. As you said, there's not a big business logic. I don't know. It's just the whole thing is just inexplicable to me on some level. But hey, you know what? I'm not 100 billionaire or whatever.
Yeah, none of us are. I mean, I think opinion is very much mixed. I would say the more the more sort of ambitious, forward-looking, excited people, tend to like Elon generally, partly because they all have Teslas. Um, they're sort of in that world, but that's going to be overrepresented among like the brightest of the Twitter alumni. People who are still there are going to be generally a lot more anti. I mean, obviously the anti people are going to be more vocal. If you're pro, there's going to be like a lot of like there's going to be like a lot of shy Tesla supporters, is my guess. Like, there's no reason getting on the rooftops and saying I'm thrilled about the new management until it sort of like sticks. I mean, I think Elon, including in the Twitter deal, kind of has a little bit of a history of rugging people. Um, to put my cards on the table, I like Elon, but I'm not the biggest fan. I'm certainly not a fanboy. I think he's done a lot of stuff that's bad. I think he's misled a lot of people. Um, I think a lot of people, you know, should correctly be, I mean, he tried to pull out of this deal very clearly. So I think, coming in and being an Elon supporter is a little bit tough at the moment. I think also because it is a restructuring, I think they are going to replace a lot, if not most, of the management. They probably should. I mean, they probably should get people who are going to be loyal to the new regime. Um, so that's going to be difficult. I mean, I think the dumb idea of many is that like, oh, like Elon ran these other companies and they're doing great, so he can just do the same thing at Twitter. I mean, it's a totally different product, totally different culture. I mean, you're not starting from scratch. Um, and I don't know that he has that much experience with restructurings. Like I think I'm very curious. It's going to be very interesting to see what kind of restructuring type executives they bring in. Um, One thing that's for sure is that when I was there, and I think this has gotten a little bit better, is like Twitter was doing too many things. So when I was there, Jack Dorsey was the CEO, and I like Jack a lot, not a little bit, but like Jack a ton. But he always had too many ideas, right? So Jack would like literally, and he was also into this like radical transparency that like even sounds insane these days. But he would send out these 7-page memos like every week, every other week of like what are the top priorities on Twitter, and I'm like, how can you have a 7 pages of top priorities? It just doesn't work. So people had a long experience of things being announced, things being publicized, and then just being canceled months later. I think any proper restructuring executive would come in, not do anything at first, keep the lights on, figure out, okay, like what do we need to do? What businesses do we want to get out of? And I do think Twitter in the past few years has done a good job of selling off assets, getting out of things they don't need to do. Like the move, like sort of onto AWS from their own infrastructure was like a great move. But they're still invested in a lot of things they probably shouldn't be doing. At the same time, like you do need to keep up. Like Twitter Spaces, I think, has been a big success, even though technology is like not great, possibly worse than Clubhouse, but like it definitely was a need. It definitely captured a lot of attention. So like, you know, I don't know. I mean, I hope that Elon kind of like delegates it to a good restructuring person and brings in good engineering people from his org. I would assume that's the plan, but like, I don't know, man. I mean, like all these people, when he first announced it, all these people that I know were like, yeah, this is like the thing that would make me want to come back to Twitter. Like none of them are going to do it. They just talk, they're not going to come back to Twitter. All these alumni are doing great. They're in their current jobs. They're like running their own companies. I don't like they're like retired, investing in like venture capitals. Like he has a lot of goodwill behind the scenes from people interested in Twitter, but they're not going to do anything to help him.
Yeah, it's all talk. It's all
It's all
talk.
talk. It's Twitter. Of course, it's all talk. It's Twitter is all talk, right? Like that's why we love it.
Yeah, that's funny. Yeah. One question that let me close out with this, because it's kind of like out of left field, but we're talking about Twitter. It's kind of a public good almost. I don't know how this would work, but I mean, here's the issue. The European Union, whatever censors are, that's not her title. She's already tweeting at Elon that, it's not going to be 100% free speech because the European Union obviously has some ideas. Obviously, places like Saudi Arabia, their view of Twitter is going to be different. What about the idea that the American government nationalizes Twitter and it's an American utility, and we impose the First Amendment on the rest of the world? I mean, it sounds crazy, but we have like Twitter is like a going concern because it has critical mass, it has network effects, and no one's going to take that.
So it's not crazy at all. Actually, by the way, a very popular view around the world is something that's not true, but is like also not entirely not true, which is a lot of people around the world basically think that Twitter was either started by or completely co-opted by the American intelligence community. And that's not true, but I think that there's like a significant amount of truth in it. Like they clearly recognize that it's an important asset. And the American, deep state or whatever you want to call it is very happy that they control it, you know, um, which is exactly why it's banned in China. So, I mean, Ben Thompson, on his like longer form podcast talked a lot about that, living in Taiwan and understanding this stuff. Like it's completely rational for China to ban Twitter. Just, the same way it's rational for the US government to think about like, do we really want TikTok, controlled by the Chinese government? Like, for example, like with, you know, relatively small stake things, but when they had the Daryl Morey controversy in the NBA last year, then like all of a sudden nothing about the Houston Rockets appeared on TikTok, right? So Twitter can absolutely do that. Like you can just, I guess the term is shadow ban, quote unquote, like a certain
Mm-hmm.
topic, right? And just not show anything about it. Like there could be an
Mm-hmm.
event going on in the world and they can do that. They don't because they are a lot more into free speech, especially with Dorsey, but they could. And I think definitely, I mean, my take on it, again, channeling Ben Thompson as well, is what you're saying is like a very American view, which is you have this thing and you're going to like solve it in like a binary black and white way once and for all. Whereas I think maybe the rest of us, whether you're coming from China, from parts of Eastern Europe or whatever, we're like a lot more happy with things being kind of muddled and kind of vague, which I think is more realistic, especially with international relations. So I think
Mm-hmm.
I think it would be a big mistake. I don't think they're going to do it for the U.S. government to come in and like try to impose stuff in a hard way, because then you're missing the opportunity to like just nudge it in a soft way. So it's like
Mm-hmm.
if you allow the Pakistani government and the German government to like email Twitter and to like make a stink about stuff they really don't like and to negotiate with them. You're kind of keeping them on board while still in practice they're kind of dominated by USG. Whereas if you force a confrontation, right, then it's like why, like
Mm.
I think people broadly generally are kind of okay with with American tech controlling a lot of the media landscape, as long as like, but there's just no point overreaching. Like it's already very much in USG's favor, right? And in that way, why would they want to run it? Like it's a great setup for
Mm.
them currently. And like Musk, I mean, you couldn't imagine a person who is both still generally popular and has very close connections to the, to the U.S. government, right, through all of their contracts and dealings and the
Hmm.
space stuff. So I think it's a great outcome for them.
So, okay, like that was going to be the last question, but I want to ask you because you brought it up. Shadow banning and all these other things. How does that happen? Like, I have friends who claim that they're shadow banned, and they obviously are, or that are, they're throttled in some ways. Their engagement drops a lot. I have other friends who have told me, they have a theory. These are more conservative friends. They have a theory that Twitter and YouTube has basically chosen not to create any new conservative or right wing stars that start getting a lot of engagement in English, whereas in other languages, it's a much more fully fleshed out ecosystem because they don't engage in this sort of behavior. You were there. I mean, what is your sense of how often this happens, and I mean, how does this even happen? I mean, is there like
Yeah,
is there a council of censorship at Twitter?
I mean, of course there is, but it's not going to be as formal. It's not going to be a bunch of very diverse people, smoking cigars, you know, or vaping or something. It's never that formal. But of course there is. Of course they're aware of what's going on in the platform, and they want to have some control over it. I mean, but it's again, it's like subtle, right? So for example, YouTube is a great example. Like the CEO of YouTube is like very, you know, is like a very well known partisan, and her views are very well known. And yet she was CEO of, I guess, is of Twitter, which, as Jordan Peterson correctly pointed out, is like the vast majority male and has interests that are like pretty different from management. So in the case of YouTube, they certainly push their own interest. I think you'd be really strange to think that that was not the case, but still allowed kind of stuff that is people want on the platform. I think a lot of the people who are shadow banned are either like really on the fringes, or a lot of people are just kind of sour grapes. Like I think a lot of their stuff frankly wasn't that engaging to begin with, to be quite honest. But I think there are things that matter. Like you can, if you are in that world where you think you're going to be shadow banned and censored, like it's sort of on you to avoid own goals, because no one's going to do you any favors. I mean, I think a lot of other stuff is obviously like, and a lot of the Twitter's control is really like not even around that. It's more like, look, we don't want you to link to certain websites, right? Or in general, they just don't like links in general. But it's not all political. Like for example, in crypto, everyone has this idea, whether it's true or not, but like it's true enough, people think it. That basically anything with the link to an Ether scam, like just gets like no views. And Etherscan, just for people who don't know, it's just a transaction on the Ether blockchain. It's just a link to a transaction. And for whatever reason, they just don't want those links. So if you post those links, people are not going to engage with your stuff because it's not going to be shown. And you kind of have to know that. In
Mm.
general, Twitter has really, really, really suppressed links in general. People don't like Twitter, generally speaking, for again algorithmic reasons and maybe like human decisions, just does not want content that is going to link out. So if you're promoting articles, that's not going to work out for you. Now, could you imagine that they have a rule in place where they sort of like decrease their own rule for sort of like the official media? Of course. I mean, it's kind of like Wikipedia, right? Everyone understands certain kinds of media is just preferred as a source. And that list isn't going to be like what maybe you and I would like, you know? But like Twitter has an interest in not crushing the New York Times. New York Times is a good customer for them, just like strategically, if anything. But in general, they crush links. So it can be logic like that. Like linking out is bad, but like if you're New York Times, you get an exception. Is that fair? No, but
Yeah.
just the way it
Well,
is.
all right. So here's a question. I've heard this linking out thing. It wasn't always true, though, right? I mean,
Correct. It used to not be true at all. It used to be the best way, but then that Twitter didn't want it, so they changed it.
So I feel like, I don't know if you know the chronology of this, because I still do probably every day. I probably link to a preprint or a science article. Like sometimes I'll do like 5, sometimes I'll do 1. I feel like the likes on those uh got like crashed in 2017, and they've never really come back. Like I used to get like, and this is back when I had probably 1/5 the number of followers that I have now, less than 1/5.
Raziv, do you look at your impressions? Because I mean, you know that, right? Like you can
Yeah,
look at Twitter analytics. So are your impressions much lower than just good messages? I would assume it's an impression issue. They're
yeah,
not being shown to anyone.
yeah. They are. You're
But
right. Okay, yeah,
no, no. So that is. I mean, you can call it shadow banning if you want to. I wish there was a more neutral term. I don't like these loaded terms. They just really are bad for discourse, you know. But it's like, dude. I mean, again, I'll explain the Twitter algorithm in a very simple way. So it's like certain kinds of content they prefer, but then also when you show it and people engage with it, then they show it to more people, right? So
yeah,
like part of it is that I think they're not entirely wrong. Like people were like, dude, I mean, think of it like again for archive, right? I mean, being in deep learning, I used to post a lot of archive stuff, and people don't click on it because like it's why should I click on it? You know, like I'll read the article later. It's just like how do I engage with it? You know, so
hmm
it's sort of a lot of it's kind of benign, but it's still true. You know,
yeah. My Substack pieces tend to. I mean, it depends on the picture I associate with them. To be
yes,
honest, people love
picture makes a huge
maps.
difference.
People love
Yes,
maps. So I can get like 500 likes on a Substack, which is great. That's my goal. So yeah, there's definitely like variance, and you get trained yourself to. I mean, depending on if you really care about likes and
yes,
retweets. When it comes to my regular stuff, uh, I mean, just candidly, I mean, I don't think this is like going to be a big shock to anyone. Um, I'm probably 50% of the time I tweet on Twitter. It's mostly because like I want to get people driving to my Substack with a pinned tweet. And so that's the only thing that I really care about, people clicking a lot. And all my other stuff, I just tweet what I really want to tweet. And, 1 out of 5 times, like they might travel and then I get a lot of engagement. That's great. But I'm not one of those people that tweets to get a specific engagement. Which I think maybe some people. I mean, actually, I know some people are. Some people,
well, you know, I was
yeah,
going to say the engagement farming is a real problem. Like, and Twitter isn't addressing it, and it's not. And I think they're just generally kind of hands off, which is generally good. But it has unfortunately become there's just too much incentive to game it, so people post kind of like intellectual thirst traps. I mean, like those ridiculous threads about here's a thread about how the road gauge is related to like the Roman chariot thing, like
yeah.
complete bullshit like that because it does well
It's
and it does well
you
in the
you talking
algorithm.
about the buckle up threads.
Oh, and everyone hates it. Like certainly in our circles, everyone hates it, but like it does do well, so people post it. You know, it travels. To your point, it gets sent to other people, and it's like, yeah, I mean, I think that's the downside of algorithmic. Well, it's actually not okay. So this is like my little hobby horse. So let me talk about this for a couple of minutes. Like it is something that sort of is the default for the way these algorithms are trained, but it doesn't have to be. So one of the coolest things that Jack talked about, Jack Dorsey, was the whole bring your algorithm thing. Do you remember when that was a bit of conversation? Or I guess like I can. So
Yeah,
basically,
I
the
don't
idea
remember
is that
that.
yeah. Go ahead.
I don't remember that particular conversation. If you want to refresh us.
Yeah, yeah. So what it was pretty cool. So basically, the idea is very simple: is Twitter right now you have this kind of like sort of like Mexican standoff, right? Where it's like Twitter, like we are all like Twitter, give us a better algorithm. You know what I mean? But like they won't let us improve the algorithm or even see it, right? But like they also don't like they need to build an algorithm that works for everyone. So the bring your own algorithm idea is pretty cool, which is that Twitter would have a default algorithm, but somebody like me or a grad student or whatever could actually write their own sort of like timeline ranking algorithm that would use the public features, basically not the full set of features, but like a complete enough subset of the features, like basic things like, okay, was this tweeting, engaged with by like someone from your close connections, right? How many times have you engaged this person in the last month? Just sort of these like numerical features, just a few dozen of them. And they could build their own algorithm, they could test it, and then like you could opt into their algorithm. So there'd be like an algorithm store, and you could be like, I want like Bob's algorithm to sort my tweets, um, which would actually kind of address a lot of these issues potentially because we are like there's just no real economic reason for them to build an algorithm that's good for Nikolai and for Razib and for other people. It just doesn't make business sense, right? But they also don't
Hmm.
allow us to like rank our own timeline in any way whatsoever. Like they have to build for the common denominator, but like for the 5% of us who are like way too online, like it would not be hard for a grad student to build something that you would find more compelling for your own stuff, or you could recommend it to your own readers, right? I think it's a very good idea. It would definitely be like it's something that there's no reason to think it'll hurt their business in any way, and that would be really fun. But unfortunately, it's probably not going to happen. Although it should, you know.
Yeah, yeah. One thing that one thing is like, Twitter obviously has massive media uptake. The media loves Twitter. They're the super users. And then there's the whole phenomenon. I don't know what you, as a former Twitter person, or what you were at Twitter, what you thought about this, but isn't it kind of funny? And this isn't some conspiracy, but I have like friends who have hundreds of thousands of Twitter followers, and they cannot get a blue check. And then like
Yeah,
some
so
some
it's
some
so absurd. Yeah.
and then some guy that works at a small literary magazine has a blue check. Actually, so I'm checking. Thomas Chatterton Williams, who's a writer at the Atlantic now. He's written for New York Magazine, all these places. He cannot get a blue check. He's got 128,000 followers. But there are people who
Yes.
have blue checks, who have like 2,000 followers because they worked at a particular
Oh, there's
magazine.
people with there's people with 300 followers that like work that write for like a local newspaper that have a blue check.
Yeah,
So look, here's the thing. So very very brief history on the blue check, and it's like very classic Twitter. Like it's kind of a mess. They didn't really design it. They didn't really define it. Like it's called verified. You know what I mean?
yes,
But it was
yes.
like then they were just kind of lazy about it. Then it just became this privilege. But they've gone through many waves. So for example, there was a time when you could apply and it got pretty like liberal and pretty open, and a lot of people got it. So I know plenty of people who like by today's standards wouldn't get it, but as long as you don't do something super duper 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 bad, like it used to be impossible to use your verified. Actually, I think Milo Yiannopoulos was like famously the first person to like be unverified, and then
Yeah.
banned a month later. By the way, I was at Twitter when Milo was still tweeting live, along with along with Martin Shkreli doing the periscopes before he went to jail. It was a really
Mhm.
wild and interesting time. But yeah, so the verify thing is ridiculous. Of course, everyone knows that, but it's like you would need people to decide on what they want it to be, whether they want it to be two tiers. I mean, my favorite is some people that we know are like now they got the approval for super follow, but not for verification, which is just very amusing. You know?
Oh, yeah, because I'm super. I have super followers. I got verified, I think in 2017. I wouldn't have done it, but I saw someone who had far fewer followers than me, who was not even a journalist really, got
Yeah,
the blue check, and I was starting to get a little paranoid about Razib imitator accounts, shall we say?
that's right. Yeah,
And
that's right. And that's the thing that's weird about it, of course, is that if you are big, you get imitators. I mean, the original motivation or whatever for verification was just that, with the fake with to sort of know which is the real account. But then it sort of it sort of took on a character of its own, right? Like
yeah,
no one could even tell you what verification means. It's like mix of things, which is like very organic and very Twitter, and like kind of very cool from an evolutionary perspective, but is completely wrong and weird and doesn't make any sense.
all right. So we've been talking for a while. We should end this, but I guess let me just ask you real quick. You're still on Twitter. I'm assuming you feel like you get value out of it.
Oh, I mean, of course. I mean, I think Twitter for me does at least a couple things which would be worth it just in of itself. So first of all, you do connect to amazing people. Like the number of actual super interesting friends that I've made through Twitter, and including you, is not completely not trivial. Um, and then also having enough of a presence, having a minimum presence, does help you for business and recruiting and things
Hmm.
like that. Like it is a way to get your stuff out. Like I actually feel very bad for people who are trying to build a new Twitter account. Some people are you have to be very talented these days, I feel like, to have an account even getting to
Hmm.
like a few thousand followers and like that are like engaged. Also, it's just so hard. But then the final thing is, of course, is just like it does give you a chance to practice writing. I think like in a way Twitter is, especially since they switched to 280 from 140. 140 was too short. Like
Mhm.
it is really like the right way to condense ideas to get actual feedback. I mean, the vast majority of us went to American schools where you never wrote for actual people, you wrote for like a prompt, and you see that with people. Like sadly, the vast majority of tech minded, or mathematically minded like people can't write or communicate at all. And I think Twitter is probably still the best place to practice, right?
Yeah, for all its faults. I mean, I think I will say for me, it's been mostly positive, obviously. It's just that periodically you get caught in some maelstrom and it's just like a pain in the butt. Or literally every single person is dunking on the exact same thing in my timeline. And I just think, I mean, come on, like you must have seen, because like I turn off the algorithmic timeline, but
Mm.
it doesn't matter because everyone's talking about the exact same thing.
That's right. Yeah, and I think just to sort of a tangent on that, I think what's very interesting is the spam and the weird stuff and all of these things that happen. There is a communication platform where you really don't see any of these problems, and that's called Slack, right? So I think an interesting bug of like email and and Twitter and Instagram and all these other platforms is that they basically like allowed people to just communicate with and reach out to people that they're not connected to. And um you know I think it has, I mean, like people talked many times at Twitter, and we even like sort of in these sort of brainstorming things, like designed ways of Twitter we could sort of have an alternative to that. But people really resisted it for historical reasons, free speech, or it's so exciting when you have these like spontaneous connections between people when different celebrities are fighting or whatever, by
Yeah.
I think a lot of the ills, I mean, this is just my opinion. I think a lot of there's some positive externalities, but there's massive, massive, massive negative externalities when you just allow people to just communicate to people like without establishing some connection first. Because you can relax that, right? Same with the email spam thing. If you simply email was set up from the beginning where you just can't cold email people, you would have downsides, but you would have upsides, right? And then you can relax it. You can say, oh, well, actually, this person's connected to a person I know, so I'm going to allow that, right? you know um so I think the two real sort of like sort of not existential issues is going to be fine, but sort of permanent issues I think are this like spam and sort of unwanted harassment reach out thing too. I think the right when people minimize it sometimes it's a real problem for people get really upset, like, and that's not going to change, and then the second one again is because of the algorithmic stuff, like just the rewards for engagement farming are just way too high, and I wish that wasn't the case.
Yeah. All right. So Nikolai, it was great talking to you, former Twitter engineer, and now you're leading deepnftvalue.com. I'll put the link in the show notes, obviously, but that's your next thing. So, it was great talking to you, and I will see you around on Twitter.
Likewise, thanks, Rajiv.
All right. Thanks.
This podcast for kids.